The metal was warm. That was the first thing Fleet Commander Vakath noticed when her inspection team boarded the derelict human orbital platform 3 hours after the ceasefire declaration. Not cold, not inert. Warm, the way a living thing stays warm for a while after it stops breathing. Every surface her sensor gloves touched registered the same reading. Residual thermal energy at levels inconsistent with any weapon discharge, any engine shutdown, any power cell depletion her analysts could model. The platform had been dark for 6 standard cycles. Dark things go cold. This one hadn't. She pulled her glove away and looked at her second-in-command, Sharak, who was crouching over a bank of human consoles that had been partially disassembled, not destroyed, not battle-damaged. Disassembled, tools left beside them in neat formation, as if the humans had simply stepped away mid-task and expected to return. What were they building? Sharak asked. Vakath didn't answer, because she didn't know. And that, after 14 months of surrounding this species' single-inhabited world with the largest armada the hegemony had ever assembled, was the answer she feared most. The hegemony's decision to act against humanity had not been made in anger. That point was considered important by the Deliberation Council, the body of 11 species that governed 43 star systems across the inner spiral. They had deliberated for 32 standard years, which by their measure was not long, barely a political season. Humanity had been detected, classified, cataloged, and discussed in the careful, unhurried way the hegemony processed all threats of the third category. Civilizations that had not yet committed violence against others, but demonstrated probability indices above acceptable thresholds. Humanity's index stood at 94.7. The threshold for action was 70. The math was unambiguous. The Council had records stretching back 4,000 years, tracking the rise and collapse of 81 civilizations. Every species that had crossed 85 on the index within its first 2 centuries of space-capable development had, without exception, eventually triggered a catastrophic conflict. Some had destroyed themselves. 4 had nearly destroyed others. The Council's mandate was simple. It did not wait for certainty. It waited for probability. And probability, in the case of humanity, was screaming. So they came. 1 million warships, drawn from 16-member fleets, arranged in a sphere around Earth's solar system at a distance calculated to prevent any possible escape vector. Not one point of exit left unguarded. The formation had taken 4 months to achieve, and when it was complete, the tactical architects of the hegemony's 7th operational doctrine described it as the most perfect containment structure in recorded history. Admiral Peter Senevale, commander of the entire blockade, had transmitted the formal notification to Earth's governing bodies using the diplomatic translation protocols humanity itself had published in its own communication broadcasts. A thoughtful touch, Senevale believed. It showed respect for the species even as it informed them of the situation. The message was simple: comply with full disarmament and submit to hegemony administrative oversight, or the containment would become an elimination. Humanity's response arrived 7 hours later. It was a single line. We need more time. Senevale had found this answer almost touching in its naivety. Of course they needed more time. Every species asked for more time. It was the biological reflex of any organism confronted with an impossible situation: reach for delay, reach for negotiation, reach for any handhold that might slow the inevitable. The Council had prepared for this. They granted 30 standard days as protocol required. Then the 30 days passed, and nothing happened. No disarmament, no administrative submission documents, no second communication, no visible military activity on the human side at all, which itself was strange, because the hegemony's sensor arrays were sophisticated enough to detect a single atmospheric shuttle launching from Earth's surface, and they had been tracking everything obsessively. What they were tracking made very little sense. The humans were not preparing defenses. They were not consolidating their small space-based military assets. They were not evacuating civilian populations underground, a common survival strategy for technologically inferior species facing superior firepower. They were doing something that the hegemony's behavioral analysts filed under a category that had to be manually created because no existing category fit. They were going to work. Factories running, agricultural infrastructure expanding rather than contracting, orbital construction, not of weapons platforms, but of something the hegemony's engineers couldn't immediately classify. Long, curved structures being assembled at 3 of Earth's Lagrange points, enormous in scale but structurally unlike anything in the hegemony's architectural databases. Whatever they were being built fast, terrifyingly fast given humanity's supposed technological level. Senevale requested a comprehensive analysis from her 5 senior science teams. All 5 returned the same answer: we don't know what they're building. She sent the reports to the council with a note attached, awaiting further clarification before proceeding to enforcement phase. The council's reply was brief: do not wait, proceed. The first enforcement action was measured. That point, too, was considered important. The hegemony targeted humanity's 3 largest orbital industrial stations, not Earth's surface, not civilian infrastructure, but the military-adjacent construction facilities that seemed most directly connected to whatever humanity was building. A precise, proportionate demonstration of capability designed to produce compliance, not casualties. The 3 stations were reduced to dispersed particulate matter in approximately 4 seconds. The human response to this arrived 11 minutes later. It was again a single line: we need more time. Vakath had been present on Senevale's command deck when that second message came in. She remembered the silence that followed it, not the silence of shock. The hegemony's senior officers were not easily shocked, but the silence of people who had expected a different answer and were now uncertain what to do with the one they'd received. They said the exact same thing, Sherek said, reading the translation twice to be certain. Yes. As if nothing happened. As if nothing happened, Senevale confirmed, her voice very still. Then, after a pause, increase the sensor resolution on those Lagrange point structures. I want to know if they stopped construction after the strike. The answer came back in 40 minutes. Construction had not stopped. Construction had accelerated. Whatever humanity was building at those 3 points in space, the destruction of their largest industrial stations had somehow made them build it faster. This was the moment, though no one on the hegemony's command hierarchy recognized it yet, when the nature of the conflict changed. Not in firepower, not in tactical positioning, not in political maneuvering. It changed in something more fundamental. It changed in the question everyone was now secretly asking, and no one was willing to say out loud. What do the humans know that we don't? Vakath had spent her entire career studying alien civilizations at the point of first hostile contact. She had written the analysis protocols that the hegemony still used for third-category threat assessment. She had led containment operations against 4 previous species, and had, she was proud of this fact, achieved compliant resolution in all 4 cases without moving to elimination phase. Species, when faced with absolute superior force, made rational choices. That was the foundational premise of hegemony containment doctrine, and it had held across 4,000 years of recorded history. The premise was beginning to experience difficulties. She requested access to every piece of translated human cultural material the hegemony's archives contained. The collection was substantial. Humanity had been broadcasting electromagnetic signals for almost a century before the hegemony found them, and the Xenolinguistics Division had spent 30 years translating everything from technical manuals to entertainment media to what appeared to be humanity's historical records. She started with the historical records. It took her 9 hours, reading without stopping. When she finished, she sat in her observation chamber for a long time without moving, looking out at the distant smear of yellow light that was Earth's sun. Her adjutant found her there and asked if she was unwell. "Pull the casualty figures from the human conflicts their own records describe," she said. "The ones they call the world wars, the ones in the 20th century by their calendar." The adjutant pulled the figures, read them, looked up. "These numbers can't be right." "They are right. I verified them against 3 separate human sources. This says they lost over 70 million individuals in a single decade-long conflict." 70 million, Vakath confirmed. "And then within a single generation, the species that lost 70 million individuals rebuilt their civilizations, expanded their populations, developed nuclear weapons, reached their own moon, and began transmitting signals into deep space looking for other life to communicate with." She paused, "looking for asterisk friends." The adjutant stared at her. "They went through that," Vakath said quietly, "and their first instinct was to reach outward, to look for someone to talk to." She turned away from the window. "I don't think we understand what we're dealing with." The human they had captured was the first point of direct contact. He had been aboard one of the construction stations the hegemony had targeted in the second enforcement action, a larger strike than the first, targeting 9 facilities simultaneously. And his survival pod had been recovered by a hegemony patrol ship before it could drift back toward Earth's gravity well. Survival rates in those pods were apparently low enough that the humans considered it something close to miraculous when they worked. He seemed to understand this. He was not afraid. That was what Vakath noticed when she entered the holding chamber. She had interviewed captured individuals from 3 of the 4 species she'd previously managed containment operations for. All of them had exhibited clear physiological stress responses: elevated respiration, elevated body temperature, reduced motor control in the extremities. The biological vocabulary of fear was broadly consistent across warm-blooded species, she had found. The human was sitting with his back against the wall of the chamber, his legs extended, his eyes moving systematically around the room in a pattern that looked less like panic and more like assessment. He was cataloging the room, looking for exits, she suspected, looking for vulnerabilities. He was maybe 32 years old by human reckoning, lean in the way she'd learned humans became when they did physical work rather than sedentary work, with a long scar along his jaw that her medical analysts told her was at least a decade old. His name, according to the identification materials in his survival pod, was Dario Vasquez, and his occupational designation read Structural Engineer, Lagrange Construction Division. She sat across from him. She had the translation device calibrated. She used it. "Mr. Vasquez, I am Fleet Commander Vakath. I want to understand what your people are building." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "How's your math?" She was not certain she had heard the translation correctly. "My mathematical competence." "Yeah, is it good? Because what I'd need to explain it, it's going to require some math, and I don't know your curriculum." He said this without sarcasm, or what she could detect as sarcasm. He said it like a practical concern. He said it like someone assessing a student before deciding which textbook to use. "I have access to advanced theoretical physics models across multiple disciplines," she said carefully. He nodded slowly, and something in his expression shifted, not relief exactly, more like he'd confirmed a working hypothesis. "Okay," he said, "then I can try, but I want something in return." "You are in no position to negotiate." "I know," he said simply. "I'm negotiating anyway." Vakath found she had no immediate response to this. She had, in the previous 4 containment operations, heard many things from captured individuals. She had never heard that particular phrasing delivered with that particular calm, as if the complete absence of leverage was simply a variable to be noted and then disregarded. "What do you want?" she asked. "Time, same thing we keep asking you for." He met her eyes. "We're close, we just need more time." She gave him 12 hours in exchange for a preliminary explanation. It was the strangest 12 hours of her career. He drew diagrams on the chamber walls using a stylus her adjutant provided. He explained things in the patient, methodical way she recognized from human educational recordings, building up foundational concepts before introducing the complex ones, checking her comprehension, adjusting his language when she showed confusion. He was, she realized with slowly mounting unease, teaching her. What he was teaching her was this. There was a way to fold spacetime at a scale that was theoretically permitted by physics, but had been considered practically impossible by every civilization in the hegemony's scientific registry. The energy requirements alone were calculated to exceed the output of a star. The structural tolerances required materials that didn't exist in conventional physics. Except, Vasquez explained, the humans had found a workaround for the energy problem, and a different workaround for the materials problem, and a third workaround for the timing synchronization problem, which was arguably the hardest one. They had found 3 separate workarounds for 3 problems every other civilization had looked at and classified as impossible. How? Vakath asked because she had to ask. He was quiet for a moment, then, you know how many people died in our last century, not just in wars, diseases, famines, accidents. We've spent the last 100 years pouring everything we had into solving problems that were killing us. Medicine, energy, materials, science, every field. We weren't doing it because we were strategically planning ahead. We were doing it because people were dying and we couldn't stand it. He set down the stylus. Turns out, solving impossible problems to stop people you love from dying is pretty good motivation for developing physics you weren't supposed to be able to reach yet. The chamber was very quiet. And the structures at the Lagrange points, she said finally, those are the anchors. 3 anchor points, he confirmed. Minimum requirement for a stable fold event at planetary scale. She stared at the diagrams on the wall. She was beginning to understand the scale of what she was looking at, not just the engineering, the implication, the reason the humans had kept saying we need more time with such specific, unchanging calm. They weren't asking for time to negotiate. They weren't asking for time to surrender in an orderly way. They were asking for time to finish. The enforcement strikes, she said slowly, and she heard something happen to her own voice that she didn't fully control. The stations we destroyed, they were secondary fabrication facilities. Yeah. Not primary components. No. The primary components were already at the Lagrange points. He looked at her. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The answer was in the diagrams on the wall, in the math she'd been following for 12 hours, in the warm metal of the derelict platform her team had found 3 days later, and in the single terrible realization that was assembling itself in her mind, with the slow, irreversible momentum of a structure that had already been built and could no longer be taken apart. The hegemony had spent 14 months surrounding Earth with 1 million warships. And the humans had spent every one of those 14 months building the mechanism to make every single one of those ships irrelevant. The report Vakath sent to Senevale was marked with the highest urgency classification available in hegemony military protocol. She sent it knowing it would be read within minutes. She sent it knowing Senevale would not believe it immediately. She sent it knowing there was very little time left to do anything useful with the information. And she sent it anyway because it was the only rational action remaining to her. Senevale's response came in 40 minutes. Confirmed receipt. Assessment team dispatched to verify claims. Maintain current blockade positioning. Maintain current blockade positioning. Vakath read those 4 words 3 times. Then she went back to Vasquez's chamber. He was asleep. She stood in the doorway, genuinely unable to account for this. He knew he had to know that the situation had reached a critical juncture. He knew that his people were potentially hours from either completing something extraordinary or being destroyed trying. and he was asleep, on the floor of a holding chamber, with his hands folded over his chest and his breathing slow and regular, as if he were napping in a garden. She woke him, she had to know. "How can you sleep right now?" He opened his eyes, oriented himself immediately, that rapid cataloging survey of the room again, and then looked up at her. "I've been awake for 31 hours, he said. "Sleeping is what humans do after 31 hours awake. There's nothing I can do from in here, so I sleep." "You might die today." "Yeah," he sat up slowly, rolling his shoulders. "Probably, but the people running the project don't need me to stay awake worrying. They need me to have been good at my job before I got captured. Either I was or I wasn't." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully categorize, not resignation, not bravado, something else, something quieter. Was the math right in the diagrams? She thought about lying, she thought about what it would accomplish. "Yes," she said, "the math was right." He nodded as if confirming something he'd already believed. "Then get some sleep," he said. "You look like you haven't slept either." She stared at him for a long moment. This species, she thought. This impossible, incomprehensible species. She went back to her command station and began composing the second report, the one she should have sent first, the one that didn't try to explain the engineering, but instead tried to explain the humans. It was harder to write. She kept stopping. She kept deleting sentences that felt technically accurate but somehow missed the thing she was actually trying to say. The thing she was trying to say was this: the hegemony's entire containment doctrine was built on a single foundational assumption, and that assumption was wrong. The assumption was that any species, when confronted with the certainty of its own destruction, would eventually make the rational choice, would eventually weigh survival against resistance and choose survival. It was a reasonable assumption. It had held for 4,000 years. It had held because it was, in fact, true for every species the hegemony had ever encountered. Except possibly one. The alert came at 3:40 shipboard time. Vakath was still at her station when it triggered, which meant she heard it before Senevale's command deck did, because Senevale's command deck was 12 light seconds further from Earth. She had 12 extra seconds to watch what happened before the command hierarchy processed it. The Lagrange point structures activated. This was a simple sentence to write. It was almost nothing to watch in the first 3 seconds. A faint harmonic resonance across all 3 sites, detectable only because Vakath's sensor array had been calibrated to maximum sensitivity specifically to watch for it. Then the resonance built, and the harmonic locked between the 3 points in a triangle around Earth's orbital plane, and the geometry of space in that region began to do something that her sensors could detect, but her mind refused to initially process as real. It began to fold. Not dramatically, not explosively, the way paper folds when someone presses a thumb into the center of it, a gathering, a concentration, a rearrangement of what had been flat into something with depth. The region of spacetime within the triangle of the 3 Lagrange points began to dimple inward along a 4th axis that Vakath's instruments could measure but her 3-dimensional intuition couldn't visualize. Then the fold completed. Earth wasn't there anymore. Not destroyed, not damaged, not hidden. The planet Earth, its moon, its immediate orbital volume, all of it simply was not present in the location where it had been located for the entirety of recorded astronomical observation. The gravity signature that the hegemony's mass detectors had been tracking for 14 months flatlined as cleanly as if someone had turned off a light. For 11 seconds, 1 million warships surrounded an empty point in space. Then the screaming started, not from the humans, from Senevale's command deck, from every fleet coordinator across the blockade formation, from the tactical channels that had been specifically designed to remain calm in all circumstances. The screaming was operational, not emotional, the sound of an entire military apparatus trying to process information that its doctrine had no category for. Vakath opened the channel to Vasquez's holding chamber. "It worked," she said. A pause, then quietly, almost reverently, "Yeah, it worked." Another pause. "Where did they go?" She checked her analysis, checked it again. 11 light-years, a yellow dwarf system, pre-catalogued as uninhabited by the survey teams. She stopped. "We know about that system," Vasquez said. "We've known about it for 40 years. The probes we sent verified the orbital mechanics. There's a planet in the habitable zone." He was quiet for a moment. "Not as nice as Earth, but we figured we'd have time to make it work. Humans are pretty good at that." "The structures," Vakath said, "the Lagrange anchors. Took them with us. Kind of the whole point. We can do it again from there, but we'll be 11 light-years away by the time anyone figures out where we went, and the fold destination was randomized within our target parameters. You'll need to find us before you can blockade us again." He paused. "How many systems does the hegemony have survey data on?" "Comprehensive data," she said carefully, "on approximately 9,000 systems. There are 400 billion stars in this galaxy." She said nothing. "We'll move again," he said, "and again after that. We'll keep moving until you stop or until we find somewhere you can't follow. And every time we move, we get better at it, faster, more precise. We've already solved the 3 problems you didn't think were solvable. The 4th problem is just time." He paused. "How's the hegemony's timeline?" The question landed like a physical impact, because she knew what he was actually asking. The hegemony's political structure ran on long timescales, 30-year deliberation periods, 4,000-year institutional memory. The hegemony was very, very patient. But patience, she was suddenly, viscerally understanding, was a weapon that could be used by more than one party. Senevale's formal request arrived in Vakath's channel 40 minutes after Earth disappeared. It was a request for a full briefing, a strategic reassessment, and an emergency session with the Deliberation Council. What followed was the longest week of Vakath's career. She briefed. She reassessed. She sat in emergency council sessions and watched 11 species argue about what had happened and what it meant and what to do next. She listened to the intelligence teams explain, with increasing desperation, that the humans had apparently been developing the fold technology for not 14 months, not the 3 years since initial contact, but for at least 15 years prior to the hegemony's arrival, meaning they had been working toward this since before they knew anyone was watching them, since before they knew the threat existed. "They weren't building this in response to us," one of the intelligence directors said, his voice carrying the particular flatness of someone whose model of the world had just collapsed. "They were building it because they always planned to leave," Vakath said. The chamber went quiet. "Humanity's probability index reached 94.7, she continued. "That index measures the likelihood of a civilization eventually engaging in conflict with others. Our analysts concluded this was a threat to the hegemony." She paused, making sure the next words landed clearly. "What they didn't consider is that a species with a 94.7 probability of conflict might have also calculated that same probability about itself, and decided to solve the problem by leaving the neighborhood entirely." A council member from the Sithrani delegation leaned forward. "You're suggesting they were building an escape route for themselves?" "I'm suggesting," Vakath said, "that the reason humanity's probability index was so high is the same reason they could build this technology. They are a species that does not accept the constraints of any given situation. Conflict index high because they push against every limit, including the limit of being trapped in a single star system with 1,000,000 ships pointed at them." She looked around the chamber. "We didn't change their situation. We just gave them a specific deadline." The silence that followed had a different quality than previous silences in that chamber. It was the silence of a calculation being run again from the beginning and returning a completely different answer. "Where are they now?" the Sithrani delegate asked. "Unknown. The fold vector was encrypted in a way we haven't broken. They could be anywhere in a 400 billion star galaxy. She let that settle for a moment. They have the technology to move again. They demonstrated the energy workaround works at planetary scale. And they left. She stopped, looked at her notes, made herself say the next part clearly. They left us a message, transmitted in the 2 seconds between fold initiation and completion. What did it say? She read it aloud. We didn't want trouble, we just wanted time. If you can find us and you're willing to talk instead of threaten, send a message to the coordinates attached. We'll be monitoring. Earth, November 14th. The Seathrani delegate stared at her. They left us a contact frequency. Yes. After we surrounded their world with 1,000,000 warships and destroyed 9 of their orbital facilities. Yes. They want to talk. Vakath set down the document. They always wanted to talk, she said. That was the first thing they ever sent into space. Signals designed to reach other life and begin a conversation. That was their first instinct communication. We interpreted the probability index and assumed aggression. What if the index was measuring something else? What if it was measuring their refusal to be limited? Their refusal to accept a ceiling on what they could do or where they could go. She thought of Vasquez asleep on the floor of the holding chamber, certain his math was right, trusting his work, conserving his energy for whatever came next. They're not aggressive. They're asterisk relentless. Those are not the same thing. She was the one who sent the reply. Not Senevale, not the Deliberation Council. Vakath composed the message herself, in human language, using the translation calibration she'd spent 14 months refining, and she sent it from her personal command terminal to the coordinates humanity had left behind like a door held open with one hand. It took 11 years for the conversation to properly begin, not because the signal was slow. The hegemony had faster-than-light communication infrastructure, but because there were factions within the hegemony that did not want the conversation to happen, and navigating those factions required the kind of patience that institutions use when they are slowly, painfully learning something new about themselves. But the conversation did begin, eventually. Vakath was no longer fleet commander by then. She was something without a precise translation in human languages, an advisor emeritus, a witness, a person whose primary qualification was that she had been there and had begun to understand before almost anyone else had. She attended the first formal contact meeting as an observer, seated to the side of the main table where the actual negotiators sat, watching humanity's representatives across the table with the same careful attention. She'd given everything about this species, since the moment she'd pressed her sensor glove to warm metal in a dark, abandoned platform, and asked a question she hadn't known she was asking. The lead human negotiator looked across the table at the hegemony's delegation and said, very mildly, "We appreciate you coming to us this time." Vakath to the side said nothing, but she felt the truth of it land. They had come to the humans, the hegemony, 11 species, 4,000 years of institutional history, 1,000,000 warships that had surrounded a single small planet and found the planet gone in the morning. They had composed messages and sent them to coordinates humanity had voluntarily provided, and then they had followed those coordinates to wherever humanity had decided to be, and they had come inside and sat down. On humanity's terms. In humanity's home. And the humans had made tea, an actual pot of it placed in the center of the table, which one of Vakath's junior analysts had flagged as a possible ritual display of dominance, and which Vakath had quietly flagged back as no. This is just what they do. This is just hospitality. This is the species that went through the worst century in its recorded history and came out the other side looking for someone to talk to. The human negotiator poured tea into cups and slid them across to the hegemony delegation without ceremony. There are 43 things we'd like to discuss, the negotiator said. Some of them are trade proposals. Some of them are scientific exchange frameworks. One of them is what we'd like to call a non-containment treaty, which is basically a document that says you agree not to do the warship thing again, and we agree not to have to fold our entire planet away from you again. We think that's reasonable. The lead hegemony negotiator looked at the T, looked at the human, said very carefully, "You prepared 43 discussion items." "We've had 11 years, the human said. "We're good at preparation." Vakath, from her seat at the side of the room, watched the hegemony delegation process this. She watched them look at the T, and the documents, and the calm human faces across the table, and the viewport behind those faces that showed a star she didn't recognize, orbiting a world that was Earth and wasn't Earth, rebuilt and renamed and still unmistakably, infuriatingly, beautifully human. She thought about warm metal. She thought about a man asleep on a holding chamber floor, trusting his math. She thought about a species that had looked at the worst imaginable situation, trapped, outnumbered, outgunned, surrounded on every side, and had decided the answer was not to fight and not to surrender but to leave, not in defeat, not in panic, but in the methodical, unhurried, relentless way they did everything that mattered to them. She thought about the probability index, 94.7, the number the hegemony had used to justify one of the largest military operations in its history, the number that had meant asterisk danger, threat, conflict incoming, the number that had seemed so clear and so unambiguous when you looked at it in a report, and so completely, catastrophically insufficient when you watched what it actually described. It hadn't measured aggression. It had measured asterisk refusal. The refusal to stop, the refusal to accept limits, the refusal to look at an impossible problem and say it was impossible, the refusal to look at a million warships surrounding their world and decide that was the end of the story. The refusal, this was the part that had taken her 11 years to fully understand, the refusal to be the kind of species that stops. The hegemony was old. 4,000 years of recorded history, 81 civilizations tracked from emergence to whatever they became, an institutional wisdom so deep it felt like gravity. And in 4,000 years, in 81 civilizations, the hegemony had never once encountered a species that responded to absolute superior force by simply deciding that force was irrelevant and building something to make it so. It had never occurred to anyone to write doctrine for that. The hegemony negotiator finally picked up the tea, took a careful, diplomatic sip, set it down, looked at the human across the table with an expression that Vakath recognized because she had worn it herself, standing in a dark platform with her sensor glove pressed against metal that was still warm. The expression of someone who had come prepared for one kind of meeting and found themselves, against all planning, in something else entirely. Something new. The human smiled at the hegemony negotiator, the way Vasquez had smiled at Vakath in the holding chamber, not triumphantly, not with gloating, but with the specific warmth of someone who had been waiting a long time to have this particular conversation and was genuinely glad it was finally happening. "Shall we start?" the human said. And somewhere, in the archives of the Deliberation Council, the analysts who had inherited the original probability assessment files were quietly, without fanfare, beginning to understand that the index had been measuring the right thing all along. They had simply been reading it wrong. Humanity was not a civilization that would eventually conflict with others because it could not control its aggression. Humanity was a civilization that would eventually conflict with others because it could not be controlled by anyone, by any force, any barrier, any blockade, any wall of warships assembled by any coalition of species with any amount of combined history and firepower and institutional certainty. Not because humans were the strongest species in the galaxy, but because they were the only species in 4,000 years of hegemony records that had never, not once, not even when surrounded and outgunned and alone and losing, looked at the situation and decided that stopping was something it was willing to do. The galaxy had learned to account for the hard limits of physics, the finite reach of biology, the predictable patterns of civilizational behavior. It had not yet learned how to account for a species for whom none of those things were final. Vakath, watching from her chair at the side of the room, picked up her own cup of tea. It was warm,